Well, thank you for attending our science exploration series this year. And please don't forget to use the QR code for the drawing for today's prize. Now, today's prize is a little different. We've normally had some College of Science swag, but today, because of the theme, we have edible dung. So if you would like some edible dung. Milk chocolate raisins, so much better than I imagine the dung would taste. But the more times you come to these different events, we have 2 more after this one, as you've seen on the screen. We will be raffling off a prize on our final one, which is a much larger prize. But each time we have a little something just for your time, and I will let you know at the end who the winner is. So I'm Dina Farrell, and I work in marketing communications here in the College of Science, and I also teach a course in science communications. And I would like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Lee Haines. So today we're going to learn about a fascinating topic that sounds kind of gross, but in the end it's really not. Who here has heard of dung beetles? It's like we've got a really dung beetle kind of crowd here today. Everyone knows what they are. So as you know, they're beetles that, as their name sounds, they feed on feces. But the work of dung beetles is really important, and that's what Dr. Haines is going to talk to us about today. She is an associate research professor in the Department of Biological Sciences, and her research focuses on diseases spread by arthropods, that group of animals that we may less than affectionately know as bugs when they live on land. During her research, Dr. Haines looks at the relationships between insects, their gut bacteria, and the diseases they transmit. She's currently collaborating on a project to repurpose herbicidal chemistries as new tools to control insect-borne diseases. She has more than 20 years of experience with parasite culture and insect rearing. In other words, she is a bug farmer and managed the largest operational tsetse colony in the United Kingdom. This African fly transmitted disease called African sleeping sickness, which, if left untreated, will kill infected animals, including all of us. She has also reared colonies of a variety of bug species that spread diseases, like mosquitoes, and even uses them in her teaching so that students can gain an understanding of these disease vectors. Dr. Haines earned her bachelor's and master's degree in Canada and completed her doctoral research at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. She has always been passionate about public engagement and enjoys being a scientific ambassador in events that showcase the wonders of insects and microbes to people of all ages. For today, you're going to imagine that you are a dung beetle. You can lift 168 Knute Rockne statues, and there's a fun fact: each statue weighs 700 pounds. You can drive across the continent using the Milky Way as your guide, and you'll save the cattle industry almost $400 million a year. Dr. Haines will share how these creatures are among the greatest gifts to farmers in terms of food security, profit margins, and human health. Now let's hear from Dr. Haines. Thank you.
I think Dina should talk for me. You did a great job. Thank you. I have a quick question for you diehards that are in the audience right now. Hands up for who has seen a live dung beetle. I'm impressed. Can you just shout out what country you saw it in? Venezuela? You too? Who had? Senegal? Tanzania? Who was over here? Turkey in Africa? US? You saw one in the US? I'm very impressed. Well, they are in the US. They're on all 6 continents except for Antarctica. So it's surprising that a lot of people don't realize that dung beetles are here in the US. And I'm sorry. I have several I'm sorries to say at the beginning. One, I keep saying UK instead of US. Apologies, because I've just recently come from there. 2, I realize that this is right before dinner, and we're going to be talking about a lot of dung. So apologies if you're going for a dinner date after this. And third, saying dung is not a normal word to use in everyday speech. People have many other colorful words for dung, and so my apologies if I use something else that sneaks out. But for this talk, we're talking about the Dung dynasty, and I hope what I leave you with is some appreciation for this creature. But by the fact that you're just here already, makes me think you already know something more about them than the general populace. So to start, what I want to do is leave you with a lasting impression by the end of this talk. I would love you to know and take home a little bit of dung beetle biology to encourage and inspire anybody in your life when you have boring dinner conversation. How dung beetles are linked to environmental preservation is a big thing that needs to be more discussed. Why dung beetles are considered a farmer's best friend. I was hoping there'd be some farmers in the audience. Is there any? Anybody a farmer? A bug farmer, maybe? And why we as scientists like to study the dung beetle. So first of all, is how do you recognize you have a dung beetle in your backyard? There will be dung beetles in your backyard, especially if you have wild animals that frequent your backyard. There will be ones that are attracted to the fecal material that's left behind. So this is a typical dung beetle anatomy. The thing I want to point out are the antennae, which make them look a bit Shrek-like. They have a head, a very large body, and underneath that hard carapace is the wings. This dung beetle is sometimes called a tumblebug, but many of you might recognize this shape because this is what the Egyptians used to worship as scarab beetles. Ooh, that turned out a little bit odd. So they range in size tremendously. They can be the size of a pea, so 1/10 of an inch, in very high abundance, and also as large as a golf ball, 2.5 inches in diameter. And you see those ones mainly as rollers in Africa. And then they can fly. A lot of the dung beetles can fly, and this is one of the most commonly asked questions if you consult Google. So yes, they can fly. They can fly up to 10 miles if they smell some really pungent dung that they're interested in, and they can live for 3 years. So it is very nice when you encounter them because sometimes you can do capture and mark and track their behavior over years because they're unusually a long-lived creature. So I thought that rather than listening to my accent, we would listen to a minute and a half from David Attenborough, who does this wonderful piece on dung beetles. And do I just slide it over to this one? Okay, I'm going to just slide it over temporarily. How many of you have not heard of David Attenborough before? You better all have. So this is his take on dung beetles. Because this is probably what you've seen on other documentaries, and that's your idea of what a dung beetle is. And it's actually not quite complete. So what I was hoping for was also to show you the snippet that didn't show up at the beginning because the links didn't copy over, unfortunately, but I will describe it to you, not in interpretive dance, but by words. So there are 3 types of dung beetles. There are more than 7,000 species globally, which is an awful lot. But here in North America, there are 80 species across the different states. And what I want to point out is the ones you just saw that David Attenborough introduced are the rollers. And they're the ones most commonly known and witnessed in countries other than the United States. So they represent this diagram where they take the balls away, they roll the balls, they take them away from the dung pile, and bury them in the soil, and that is where their young will develop. Then we also have the dwellers. These are the lazy dung beetles. They find a giant pile of dung. They think it's heaven. They dive inside of it, and they lay their eggs, and that's where their babies mature. So it's like a one-stop shop. You come to eat, and you come to raise your babies. And then there's the tunnelers, and these ones perhaps have the largest impact on soils. They make very long tunnels underneath the dung pile. They go from underneath, they excavate and pull the dung balls down into these brood chambers. They lay eggs in the brood chamber, and then the larvae will eventually eat it out and then crawl up and emerge as adults again. So these 3 different types, even though they are dung beetles, they have very different lives, but they still all contribute to the redispersion of carbon and also nutrients and seeds into the environment. So the life cycle is interesting because it can last anywhere from 6 weeks to a year. So we have the dung beetle egg is laid inside of the dung ball. Then the larva hatches and gradually eats inside of the ball, and it's almost like it's entombed in there. It then matures into a pupae, and then X amount of time later, you have your new adults. Now, these grubs are very large. That is a human hand holding one, and you can see they sort of have the beetle characteristics with the head and the legs, which are all curled up. Once they eat enough and they trigger metamorphosis, they turn into a pupa, which looks a lot more like the adult, and then the adult emerges. So there's 3 distinct stages. The larvae start out very small and just mature into these great big fat ones. These are very nutritious, and many, many creatures dine on them, including human beings. So that's what I said. Now, interestingly, they are active all summer, but here in Indiana and many other states in the north or Midwest, they're only active from May until October. So they do hibernate. The larvae hibernate, the balls hibernate, and so do the adults. But in states like South Carolina, you can find them all year. And of course, in other tropical areas, different countries, they are active all year. So here, there is a beautiful species in Indiana that not many people know about. It's called the rainbow scarab. It is a tunneler, so that's why people don't see them, because they're buried underneath the dung pile and not rolling across the surface of the ground. So if you're lucky, you can find a very giant, fresh deposit from a cow, lift it up, but first of all, get permission from the farmer to be there. Second of all, check that there's no bulls around. And third, wear gloves, please, wear gloves. So if you were to excavate a large cow pie, underneath you would see all the tunnels of these different scarabs if the land is healthy. But these truly are beautiful. So this is the female, she's showcasing her wings here. This is the male, and the males in this species have a huge horn, and it's actually quite beautiful. And you can see that these are probably prized for their beauty, and they are used in jewelry. So I don't know who would wear dung beetle jewelry, but lots of people buy them for mounting in their homes as decor, even though they're very small. So to a dung beetle, dung is not just dung like it is to us. It's dinner, drinks, because the adults drink all the liquids from the dung. It's a nursery, and that's where they lay the larvae inside, the egg inside. And it's also, most people don't know this, is a mobile thermal refuge. So this is looking at the different temperatures. And in very hot climates where you have lots of dung beetle rollers, where the sand can get incredibly hot, the beetles start to cook. So what do? They stand on top of their dung ball and lick their feet and dance. And it's a way that they cool themselves off. And everyone thought before it was a way to sense out direction, because they have to see where they're going to roll the balls. But it's not. It's actually to cool off their feet. So it's a thermal refuge. So the world's strongest insect is the bull-headed dung beetle. This won the award. It lifts 1,141 times its own body weight, and I know that that's really hard to comprehend, so I put it into terms that are more akin to Notre Dame. So those of you who have been following Notre Dame for a while, this is Jerome Bettis, who is a famous footballer. He, at his prime, was 251 pounds. So if we calculate how much he would have to weigh to mimic this beetle, he would, to lift his body weight of that many times, have to lift 286,391 pounds. Now that's really difficult to imagine, is it not? So I've made it a little bit easier for this crowd, and that is, if you look at the Knute Rockne statue outside of the stadium, that weighs 700 pounds. So that is the equivalent to 409 Knute Rockne statues that Jerome would have to carry. That's phenomenal. Than one tiny beetle. And they do that so that they can shovel a huge amount of dung balls running around, and also to fight. And I'm going to show you a dung beetle war now, and you'll understand and see how they are the kung fu masters of the insect kingdom. And we're not going to listen to all of this because the gentleman who's watching is very enthusiastic about what he's seeing. And it's 2.5 long minutes of some very interesting commentary. So I'm only going to play the first little bit.
Big fight here at the moment on the ground. You can see the dung beetles are chasing each other. They are fighting for the ball. Look at that. Look at that. So this is interesting. Look at that. The one which is on top now was on the ground. Now it's on top. The other one is coming. This is a big fight. So you can see that some are lazy to start their own balls and they come and steal. Look at that.
I'm going to stop it there. But what I really wanted you to notice is that they don't bite. They pick up their opponent and throw them. And the whole point is to try and get it to get on its back. Because once a beetle is on its back, it has a very difficult time, like a sheep, turning itself over. So then the beetle can roll away uninhibited by the attacker. I had to laugh. This guy was getting so much pleasure.
It want to come off. This is a big fight. Let's see who's going to win here.
The dung beetle wars. So one of the things that I thought would be really interesting was to bring up what has happened with dung beetles in Australia, because we are far behind in terms of a country that recognizes the importance of dung beetles. So in Australia, there was a dung beetle project launched in 1965. It ran for 20 years. And it was because they had massive problems with imported cattle into this continent. And what they sought to do was import 55 species of dung beetles, and they were from Australia, some, well, not imported, but from New Zealand, Hawaii, Africa, and Southern Europe. And the reason why they chose so many different countries is because dung beetles are exquisitely prepared to dine on dung from specific animals, usually, and in specific climates. So if it's too hot or too cold, or they don't like the shape of the poo, or the poo is too wet, they will not eat it. And so they had to look at many different species to see what would survive in Australia and what would feed on cattle, because cattle are not native to Australia. And what happened was they isolated many dung beetles, put them into these areas where there were cattle, and nothing happened. What they found out was the dung beetles were used to eating kangaroo and wallaby fecal material and wanted nothing to do with cattle. So it was a good learning experience. So this gentleman, this Hungarian entomologist, Mr. George Bornemisa, came to Australia in 1950 and said, "There, we have a problem. You have way too much fecal material all over the place. We need to find a way to get rid of it because your productivity in cattle is going to drop." So this gives you an idea of just what a cow can produce. So they can have, that's supposed to be 12 cow pies per day, which equals 12 tons per year, a single cow. One cow pie can grow up to 2,000 flies. Like, we're not talking about dung beetles right now. This is just a phenomenal amount of flies. There are 28 million cows in Australia right now, as of last year. That is the equivalent to 336 million tons of dung per year. Now that would take a lot of work to clear that off the land. So the flies are attracted to fresh dung, and they ended up being a scourge across Australia. They impacted the weights of the beef and dairy farmers, not the weights, their returns. They caused all kinds of interesting phenomena with humans because there were so many flies, because there was so much fecal material, that people couldn't go outside. There was no such thing as outdoor dining because there was too many biting flies. And these are flies wanting your tears, they want your face, they want anything that's damp, and they're also the biting flies. So it was a big problem, and Australia was in dire need for some sort of solution that didn't involve pesticides or insecticides. So George decided, let's do the dung beetle thing. So here is an example of some of the flies that would attack you should you be in this area. And it's even, these are common in the United States as well. So we have the horn flies, which are blood-sucking, and they cause things like pigeon fever, skin infections, and mastitis in cows and also other animals. And then there's the face fly, and these want your tears or your saliva, and they will swarm you. They cause things like pink eye only because they're transmitting bacteria on their feet. They can introduce bacteria into sites and cause tissue damage and reinfection in wounds so that they will not heal. So they're major nuisance pests as well as disease transmitters. So having dung beetles, and this is what they showed in Australia, that when you introduce them to the land, they drop these fly populations by 95%. And part of the reason they were able to do this is because when there is fresh dung, it is a huge resource for all kinds of living creatures, particularly the insects. And so the dung beetles can work so quickly that they dry out that cow pat immediately. Like within 2 hours, it can be gone. So you end up with no more of this juicy manure for the flies to colonize. And any eggs that are laid are desiccated because the flies are drying out. The manure has dried out. Not only that, they're competing for the food, but they're also killing the fly eggs. And it's not the mite, it's not the dung beetles that are just doing it themselves. I'm going to show you whose it is. So this was taken from the Australian Cattle Farmer Association, the Meat and Livestock report that came out in 2008 that was doing a retrospective study on what had been done with introducing dung beetles into Australia. And I want you to look at the graph on the left, the subsoil phosphate levels. So this was just looking to see how much phosphate had gone into the soil or been washed off. And the y-axis, you can see how much phosphate is there. And then on the x-axis, you can see the beetle tunnels versus just spreading surface manure versus no dung at all. So if you just spread manure on the surface of your field, you do not have any retention of phosphate whatsoever. It's only when you have the dung beetles that are taking the manure and bring it down into the soils that you can see the retention. On the other side, the graph is nitrate levels, also very important for growth of plant matter. And again, if you have beetle tunnels, you end up retaining a lot of the nutrients from the manure instead of having it wash away. They also make your soils more permeable, as you would imagine, with all the beetles digging down into the soil. You would have tunnels, you would have holes, burrows that allows rain to go inside of them, and it also has a great impact on worms that are coming into the area, which again increases the value of your soils. And the last one that I wanted to highlight, this is a beautiful report. So if you're really interested in how dung beetles influence, you can see that the Meat and Livestock report has done many different experiments. And this one made me smile because they set up individual plots of land. And here you're looking at a plot of land where it's very deep barrel that's been buried, and they put dung beetles in the surface for 3 months, and then they initiated a rainstorm to see how much of the fecal material that they had added to that had run off and what was happening. And what you would expect is that if you had the dung beetles, you can see that not a lot of the dissolved organ carbon was running off. It was embedded in the soil. And if you had dung only, it all washed away. And so you ended up with this large concentration of organic carbon, instead of sinking into the soil, was released into the environment. So this brought me to the question, or one of the things that we were talking about that I wanted to impress upon people, especially if there were farmers in the audience, is why are dung beetles coined a farmer's best friend? Now, if you know anything about farming, this phrase is usually linked to an earthworm, not a dung beetle. But I think they can both share this title. So there are many things that they can do. I'm sorry to overwhelm you with text. This is all supposed to be animated, so you wouldn't be reading it all. But what I really want to highlight are the yellow ones. And the first one is reduce populations in horn and face flies that breed in dung. I've already showed you the importance of doing that. The other one is reduce the animal diseases by rapidly burrowing infected dung. And in that case, I'm talking about gastrointestinal parasites that are in the cattle. So when they are excreting these parasites like tapeworms and roundworms and the eggs of these, they want them to be inside of a nice, moist cow patty. And if the dung beetles are taking away all that moisture, it means your diseases cannot continue or cannot flourish. And then the last one in yellow is the fertilizer delivered exactly to the grassroots where it's needed. These are some examples of what you would see on cattle, unfortunately. So you're seeing, excuse me, at the top is the the horn flies, and the bottom is the face flies. And it can be really pronounced. And usually if there are injuries on these cattle, it just gets far worse, and it causes a lot of money that the farmers have to put out for treatments of their animals. So if you were to employ the dung beetles on your land, or to make sure that your land does have dung beetles, you would see that it would save you a lot of money. And it actually saves the US cattle industry an estimated $380 million every year, which is a profound amount of money when you think about it. But there is a problem. The dung beetles are disappearing. And it's not just because of climate change, although that is a factor, or intensive farming practices, but it's also because of the use of this drug, and it's called ivermectin. And this is one of the drugs that I work with. It is an anti-parasiticide. It kills parasites, so if you need to deworm your animals, it's a really strong one, and it works very well. But the problem is that it's extremely toxic to the dung beetles, and not just the dung beetles, but all the bacteria that live in the dung that the dung beetles feed on. So when they make these beautiful dung balls, or they do their tunneling and they give their food to the offspring, they die. They can't eat it. So you're wiping out entire generations. So this schematic below just shows you the differences in toxicity to the left and less toxic to the right, and ivermectin is super toxic. So it's one that needs to be considered when you're going to treat your animals. So you can see that when you do administer this drug, 32 to 64 parts per billion will be excreted into the manure. That's an awful lot, especially when only you need 16 parts per billion to kill a dung beetle. So what can we do? Oh my, I'm very sorry about that. A lot can be done. So first of all, when you graze your animals, don't let them graze too low, because all the parasites are quite low to the ground. So if you keep them on higher grass, they don't get infected as badly, and therefore you don't have to administer ivermectin to deworm them as frequently. You can use tannin crops for ground cover, and I've got a picture there of chicory, and that is also anti-parasitic, anti-parasitic. So it's a natural way to keep the parasites at bay. When you do need to deworm your cattle, just keep them off the fields so they're not doing a lot of fecal deposition on areas that are ripe with your dung beetle population. Keep them in a corral, or have a field that's designated for them so that the dung beetle population can survive. And then it's really good to embrace a reactive, not a preventative deworming program. So if you have any pets, it's quite often that you have a deworming program every 6 months. You have to do something to keep your pets healthy and happy. And that's not the case with cattle. You want to see if there's any parasites in the infected cattle before you decide to treat them. So it's more of a reactive program. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about why are scientists fascinated by dung beetles. And it's not because they're cute, or they're clumsy, or they have unusual lives, but they actually have several things that can help us in our lives. First of all, they have a lot of antimicrobial and antifungal natural molecules, and this is inside of their saliva and in their guts, because they're eating really nasty bacteria all the time in fecal material. So understanding how that cocktail is not harmful to them is important for us, because when we get exposed to these cocktails, we have a high chance of becoming sick. So there's some sort of natural, they're called antimicrobial peptides, that are expressed in saliva and the guts, which can help the bacteria thrive, and the good bacteria and the bad ones die. The second point is that they have a self-cleaning exoskeleton. So you saw the pictures of the dung beetles going into the dung, and it doesn't stick to them. They're able to wipe it off. And this is really an important field. It's called biomimicry, where scientists, and material scientists in particular, are trying to find out how their exoskeleton can deflect the collection of debris and dung. You can design many things that would take advantage of that situation. Third, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, is the ability to navigate using polarized light and the Milky Way. They're the only beetle known to be able to go in a straight line from a dung pile, these are the rollers I'm talking about, without getting confused, and they finally figured out how it was done. They also have an unusual relationship with nematodes and mites. that is fascinating to explore. They're used in biological disease control, and of course, for climate change, they're involved with carbon sequestration. So many reasons for scientists to be involved with these, study on these. So just to go a little bit more into dung beetle navigation, because this is a great conversation starter when you have dead space in a group of people. So dung beetles can see 1,000 times better than a honeybee. Nobody thinks that. Nobody ever considers that. I'm not sure why, but they have the best daytime vision of any insect. And to find out how the dung beetles that survive at night or that feed at night navigate, because most time vision is linked to daylight, they created little baseball caps that they put onto these dung beetles. These are the rollers again, to try and block out their view of the sky. And they put them into a planetarium and turned them loose to see how they would move. In this graph here, A is showing if they could see the starry sky in the planetarium, meaning they didn't have the cap on, they generally moved in a straight direction outside of the center port where they had put them. If you managed to put the baseball cap on them, which would pertain to your starry sky you can't see, this is the kind of pathway that you see them taking, which is very long and tortuous. And if you were trying to get out of a dung pile very quickly so you didn't have any competitors trying to steal your ball of dung, this would not be a smart strategy. You get lost wandering around. So from this, they concluded that not only can they see through the Milky Way, but they can also see polarized light, which can filter through clouds. So fascinating insect, considering they're doing all of this pushing upside down with their head touching the ground and their eyes very weak, still able to navigate streaks in the sky. And this is the other thing that I find really interesting, because I look at symbiosis between insects and how they influence the way the insect can survive. And on a dung beetle, this is a beautiful iridescent dung beetle that is upside down, so you're looking at its belly. There are, quite often, if you go out and find some and do your digging around, there are things called mites, and this beetle is heavily infested with mites. This does not mean the beetle is sick. This means this beetle is a good bus, and all the mites are attached to it in the hopes that the beetle will carry them to the next pile of dung. So looking closer, these mites, when they're delivered to dung piles, they devour fungi that's pathogenic for your crops, and also fly eggs. So it's them that are introduced into these dung piles that are helping to control the fly populations, even more than the dung beetles themselves. And this is what one of these creatures looks like. It's very tiny. They're actually hairy, but that doesn't stand out very much, but they're fascinating. And then not only do the dung beetles have these hitchhiking mites, which are very good for the dung beetles, they have these nematodes, and they're transmitted sexually they're both found in the male and the female reproductive organs, and they are deposited when the female lays her egg. And these nematodes flourish inside of the dung ball, and they help digest any of the woody ingredients that your herbivores haven't been able to digest. So you end up with way more organic material for the dung beetles to feed off, and you get larger, healthier offspring. So it's not just the dung beetles, but it's also their passengers that are creating such a wonderful symbiosis. So in summary, let's say we really need to appreciate dung beetles, and I hope that I've flagged a few things you didn't know before, because they're important for pest control, soil enrichment, farming success, and the amount of profits that you can take. It contributes to healthy ecosystems, and I think they're amazing scientific subjects. They're just rather hard to rear because you have to go out collecting dung to keep them alive in your lab. So I wanted to play this one, because we have time, one interesting commentary. If you're familiar with Z. Frank, anybody heard of Z. Frank before? He's quite an interesting gentleman in the way that he presents true facts about insects. So I'm going to run, it's 2.5 minutes, and it's what he's going to say about the dung beetle.
Here are true facts about the dung beetle. The dung beetle survives mainly or solely by eating the faces of other animals. It's terrifying. Wait, that's a typo. It eats the feces of other animals. Oh, it's even worse. The rolling dung beetle finds dung with its acute sense of smell. The dung beetle then selects a choice piece to roll into a bowl. Oh, that's disgusting. Cut it. Cut the clip. I told you I'm not going to narrate the footage of poop. It's just not going to happen. This isn't better. This has nothing to do with the dung beetle. Fine. The female dung beetles then judge their potential mates by the size of their balls. Oh, come on, that's a lynx. Wait, why is he stalking that Santa baby? Run away, Santa baby. After a mating pair is established, the female often attaches herself to the dung ball chariot, and the male rolls them away from the dung pile. He does this backwards by pushing on the ball with his hind legs. Imagine getting into a car and putting your head face down on the seat, and then steering with your butt. That is how the dung beetle do. Needless to say, they get lost from time to time. When it strays off course, the dung beetle climbs on top of its ball and uses the position of the sun, the moon, and even the Milky Way to reorient itself. Sort of like how ancient sailors once did, except without the giant ball of shit. Here, a scientist uses a mirror to confuse the hell out of a dung beetle. Along the way, he must face challengers who seek to claim his turd ball, the ensuing battle sometimes lasting for hours. When they have finally completed their journey, the young freaky couple digs a small hole in the soft sand. The female then lays her eggs inside the dung ball and then seals them up, using more dung, her saliva, and her own feces, just for good measure. And then when the baby is born, it eats its way out. The circle of life. Just remember, no matter how bad your job is, even if you shovel crap for a living, at least you're not doing it naked and with your mouth, and then eating it.
Isn't she great? She's just great.
Sometimes they're much more colorful than that one. So I warn you in advance, if you start Googling Z. Frank, brace yourself. So he presented many things that you already knew, right? You recognized stuff that I had already told you, and hopefully nodded knowing a little bit more about it than what he covered. So I wanted to leave 20 minutes for chatting, and it's exactly 20 minutes. I'm very impressed. So thank you for listening, but I'm going to leave you with one thing. So how many of you played with AI? Hands up. AI, yeah, that's great. So you can use different programs to create images. So I put in to AI an image that I wanted it to produce. And this was informed on my childhood, growing up on a farm. And I realized that my dad and I were actually a human dung beetle equivalent, shoveling around the horse manure for our pasture lands, and that would be me riding on top. So it's not such a foreign concept after all. So with that, I would like to finish and ask you if you have any questions.
A couple. One, at the very beginning, you said, if you pick up a cow pile, if the soil is healthy, you'll find dung beetles there. So is there sort of a go, no-go for a dung beetle if farmers or ranchers were trying to introduce it into their pasture where the soil is so bad, it's going to be really hard for you to do that? Is that an element, or will the dung beetles find a way?
It depends on where you've introduced them from. And the soil, so long as it's moist and the dung beetle can tunnel through it, because we're not thinking, at least here in the United States, we're not thinking about a roller, we're thinking more about those that could dig down. If it's super compacted soil, they will have a very difficult time. But usually underneath a nice fresh dung pie, the soil gets a bit juicier. So long as they're within a close enough range to smell it and land on it and bury into it, it is enough, especially for the dwellers, because they don't have to tunnel except for the poo. So they usually can establish in that regard, yes. It would be more the temperature that would be the inhibitor.
If I can ask just one other question. So I work with folks that work on salmonella and salmonella super spreaders from cattle. So what sort of impact is, I would assume it possibly could be in a positive way, you had an appropriate dung beetle population, could that minimize the opportunity for salmonella to be present in the field of cat-operative transmission? Or is that a different thing from some of the other diseases that they might help control?
If the salmonella was being delivered fecally, it would have a very large impact, yes. But if it wasn't, then no, the dung beetles wouldn't be contributing. But certainly other pathogens, bacterial pathogens, fungal pathogens that are transferred into the dung, they will be heavily impacted negatively on them. Great for the dung beetle because they won't get sick on whatever they're eating. So it is a way to absorb that threat from the environment. Yes. Thank you. Who else had a question? I did see some hands. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
That was awesome, by the way. Any negative impact bringing non-native beetles to Australia? Was there any?
I think they were very paranoid about that, being Australia. And they did many years of testing in controlled environment to make sure. And in the end, I believe there's only 5 or 6 beetles that made the cut that could survive in the different environments where they were introduced. And so far, there hasn't been a negative impact. And they've been looking at this now for many decades. So it's they were all sterilized. That's something interesting. So they didn't bring in the mites. And I don't know if they knew about the nematodes at the time. But certainly they didn't have the mites, and the mites help with the health of the dung beetles, but they were very cautious, not knowing what the other kind of insects the mites could be able to affect. Any more questions? Yes?
You said in Australia that they were having problems because the dung beetles were more enamored with the kangaroo feces than with pretty much anything else. Do you know how they overcame that? Because I'm pretty sure Australia still has kangaroos.
So that's one of the bonuses to doing this in Australia. The dung beetles that they imported from other parts of the world were fixated on herbivore poo, more specifically the ruminants, like the cattle. So there's no competition for resources between the natives and the invasives. They're not really invasives, but they kind of are, introduced species. So it's not an issue. And unless the kangaroos start grazing with the cattle, which I don't think will happen, you won't even see a mixing of those species for hybridization or that threat. Did that answer your question? I've never thought of a dung beetle enamored with a type of poo before, but it's true, they are. Yes, sir?
You mentioned, great talk, thanks so much. You mentioned the impact of the drug on the dung beetle population, but also climate change. And I was curious, what are the major, I'm thinking of the video where the dung beetle is cooling its feet on the dung ball. Are there other, what exactly are the major influences of climate change on dung beetle population?
So one of the biggest is the water and the rain. So they can flood the fields and then it kills off all the offspring because they're not down far enough. So that's one thing. Also the changing weather patterns when it's getting too cold or too hot and the beetles simply can't adapt as quicker. But mainly it's the farming practices that are destroying the beetle population. So it's not just the use of the dewormers and ivermectins, but it's also insecticides and pesticides that influence the soil microbiota. And if you're feeding off the soil microbiota or your cattle are feeding on it, on treated land, it changes what they're pooping out. So yeah, and can they adapt quickly to climate change? That's debatable. You have all these pockets of different species of dung beetles, so there's potential to bring one from a hotter climate to recolonize something locally, but it takes a lot of work to do that, and you have to know, first of all, what's on your land, and people don't think they have dung beetles because they've never seen dung beetles rolling along the soil. And they haven't thought to kick it over and then know what a dung beetle looks like because there's so many flies. It's such a resource. I feel like if you'd have free ice cream and all of the students arrive, it's not just going to be students, it's going to be faculty and staff and dogs and everything. So it's really, first of all, knowing what is there, preserving what you have there, and then trying to build up those numbers through your farming practices. Anything else? No questions from your Turkish background? No? Yes?
You obviously spent a lot of time talking about cattle. The U.S. has major problems with poultry and pork fecal matter causing Pastures outbreaks.
Yeah.
I assume there are dung beetles that prefer pork poop, but I haven't heard are those types of farmers trying to build large populations, or is it because they're more enclosed?
Usually, exactly, because they're more enclosed, it's usually less of a problem. But to answer one of your other questions, do dung beetles have a preference for a certain species? Yes, very much so. And they are attracted by the smell. So here's a fun fact for all of you. Dung beetles usually like herbivore and omnivore fecal material. If you are out researching dung beetles, how are you going to trap them or know how to find them? It doesn't mean you have to follow a flock for birds or a herd of cattle around. No, you use your own fecal material. So human feces is like the creme de la creme for dung beetles. You can use it to attract anything because it's a combination of what you're eating and it's very smelly, and we're actually very poor at digesting food. So it means there's loads of nutrients there for the dung beetles to come to. So even when you're talking about very specific dung beetles, they will always be trapped by your own resources.
Sounds like you solved your lab problem.
Yeah, but you still got to bring them back to the lab and do things. The other thing is they are so specific in very niche environments. One of the most specific dung beetles is a dung beetle that clings to the anal hairs of a sloth. And they wait for the sloth to defecate so that they can quickly grab onto the falling material and guaranteed a meal, because the competition for any type of fecal material falling to the bottom of, say, a jungle is too high. So they get right to the source and wait for it. Now, that is a really specialized dung beetle, but they exist, and there's many. I've just pulled out the sloth one. Yeah? No. Great fun facts before dinner. Yeah. Anything else? No? Well then, thank you very much for coming. And I think there's a winner of my dung treats.
Yeah, we have dung treats, which are chocolate-covered raisins. So you might.
They are good. I've tried them. They're very tasty.
We did wait a few minutes before you eat them after that talk. Stephanie Morgan is our winner.
Nice.
Oh my goodness. This is not fixed. This is one of my Ph.D. students here. Enjoy. So I was just going to say one last thing. If I didn't cover anything or you have more questions, or there was somebody else that should have been here that couldn't make it, that is my email address, and I usually am pretty good at writing back to people, especially if it's to do with dung beetles. So thank you for coming. Have a great weekend and enjoy the game tomorrow.
Oh, thank you.